The billionaire came home early. The black maid teaching his son left him astonished. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when billionaire Richard Stone decided to come home early from his usual business meetings. The tall, imposing man had built an empire from scratch, and his wealth allowed him to live a life most people could only dream of. But despite all his success, something in his life always felt missing. His son, Jason, was a bright child, but Richard had little connection with him. The boy was often left alone, either in his lavish private study or in the large, empty playroom, surrounded by tutors and housekeepers, but never real companionship. Richard was used to the silence, the quiet of his mansion, and the absence of emotional connection. But today would be different. As Richard entered his home through the grand foyer, he expected the usual stillness. However, as he passed the hallway leading to the living room, something caught his attention. Laughter. Not the kind of laughter one would expect in a place like this, where the staff were mostly silent and only spoke when necessary. No, this was the sound of genuine joy. Curious, Richard slowed his pace and peered around the corner. What he saw took him completely by surprise. There, sitting on the floor, was his son Jason. But he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him, teaching him something with intense focus, was the housekeeper, Clara. Clara was a woman of humble origins, a black woman who had worked in Richard's home for several years. Her quiet demeanor and dedication to her job had made her an invisible presence in the household, blending into the background while everyone else remained caught up in their own worlds. Richard had never paid much attention to her, always seeing her as just another staff member. But today, she was different. The way she sat there, engaging with his son in a way that no tutor or private school could, was a moment that struck Richard deeply. Jason was laughing, his eyes wide with excitement as Clara explained something to him with a passion that Richard had never seen in the boy before. The contrast was stark. Richard's son, the heir to a vast fortune, sitting on the floor, completely captivated by a woman who was supposed to be just a caretaker. It was a moment that caught Richard off guard. He had expected to walk into his home and find the usual quiet. But what he found instead was the raw, unfiltered connection between his son and a woman he had barely noticed. Richard stood frozen, hidden in the hallway, watching. The room was silent except for the sound of Clara's calm voice and Jason's laughter, filling the space with warmth and life. The realization hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. How had he let his son become so distant, so disconnected? Was it really just his wealth and business that mattered, or had he neglected the one thing that truly mattered, his family? As he watched Clara and Jason interact, something began to stir within him. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of something he had long forgotten: guilt. Guilt for not being the father Jason needed, for not providing him with the emotional support he so desperately craved. Richard's mind raced. He had been so wrapped up in his own world of meetings, deals, and financial success that he had neglected the one thing that could give him true happiness: a relationship with his son. He stepped back into the shadows, unsure of what to do next. But one thing was certain. This moment, this quiet scene in his home, had opened his eyes in a way nothing else had. He needed to change. He needed to reconnect with his son. And Clara, the woman he had so easily overlooked, had just shown him the way. Richard stood motionless, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, his heart racing. Clara, the quiet housekeeper, was still seated on the floor, smiling softly as Jason, his son, giggled in response to her teachings. The connection between them was undeniable. Jason, who usually kept to himself in his expansive room or private study, was now engaged, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. It was a side of him that Richard had never witnessed before. Clara, a woman whom Richard had never given much thought, was now the one holding his son's attention. Richard felt a pang of guilt rise within him. How had he allowed himself to become so detached from his own child? How had he let his wealth and work overshadow what truly mattered, his family? As he stood there, he realized that he had been living his life in a bubble, consumed by his business and success, while his son had been left to grow up without the guidance and care he truly needed. The quiet warmth in the room only amplified the emptiness Richard felt. His son, sitting on the floor, was showing a side of himself that Richard had never seen. Vulnerable, happy, and full of life. He had been so caught up in his own world that he had missed out on these precious moments. As Richard quietly backed away, he knew something had to change. He could no longer be the absentee father. He had to find a way to reconnect with his son before it was too late. The next day, Richard couldn't shake the image of Jason and Clara together. He decided that it was time to take a step he had never considered before, spending more time with his son, becoming more involved in his life. He made an unexpected decision. He would not only start spending more time at home, but he would also spend time with Jason, just the two of them. The idea of disconnecting from his business world, even for a short time, felt almost foreign to him. But deep down, he knew it was the only way to fix what had been broken for so long. Later that afternoon, Richard walked into Jason's study. The boy was sitting at the desk, surrounded by books and papers. Jason looked up, surprised to see his father standing there. "Dad, what's up?" he asked, his voice soft. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of how to start the conversation. "I've been thinking," Richard began slowly, "and I realized that I've been neglecting you. I've been too focused on my work, and I've missed out on being there for you. I want to change that. I want to spend more time with you." Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by his father's sudden admission. "Are you serious?" he asked, not quite sure if he should believe it. Richard nodded, a rare sincerity in his eyes. "Yes, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I don't want to miss any more of these moments with you. We can do something together. Anything you want." Jason hesitated for a moment, his mind clearly processing his father's words. Finally, he shrugged. "Okay, sure. We can start with playing a game. Maybe a board game or something." Richard smiled, the tension in his chest easing a little. It was a small step, but it was a step toward the connection he had long neglected. As they sat down together at the table, Richard couldn't help but feel a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly present in his son's life, and it felt good. As the evening wore on, Richard realized that this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let his son slip through his fingers again. There was so much to make up for, and he was determined to do it. The next day, Clara noticed the change. Richard made a point to greet her with a nod of appreciation as she went about her duties. It was a subtle gesture, but it was enough to show her that he was beginning to see her in a new light. Clara had always been more than just a housekeeper to Richard. She had been a quiet observer, and in many ways, she had been the glue that held the household together. Richard knew he owed her more than just gratitude. He owed her an acknowledgement for what she had done for his son, something that he had not been able to do himself. As the days passed, Richard's relationship with Jason grew stronger. The walls that had once separated them were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. Jason was more open, more engaged, and Richard found himself genuinely enjoying his time with his son. It wasn't just about playing games or doing activities together. It was about being present in each other's lives in a way that had been missing for so long. For the first time, Richard felt the weight of fatherhood, and for the first time, he understood the value of being there for his son. As he sat across from Jason one evening, laughing over a shared joke, Richard realized that he had never felt more fulfilled. This was what life was about. Not business deals or financial success. It was about family, love, and the connections that truly matter. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments that Richard had longed for. He had begun spending more time with Jason, and each day brought them closer. Whether it was playing board games, talking about school, or just watching television together, Richard found himself reconnecting with his son in ways he never thought possible. Jason had become more open, and Richard noticed how much his son had been holding back all this time. He had missed out on these moments, and now, Richard was determined to make up for the lost time. As the evening settled in, Richard decided it was time to take the next step. He wanted to show Jason that he was serious about changing, that he was ready to be the father Jason deserved. Richard walked into the living room, where Jason was sitting, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Jason," Richard began, his voice softer than usual. "I was thinking, how about we take a weekend trip together? Just the two of us. We can go somewhere quiet, away from all the noise." Jason looked up from his phone, surprised by the suggestion. "A trip? Just us?" he asked, his tone unsure. Richard nodded. Yeah, we could use some time to just relax, you know? We can go to the beach or the mountains, whatever you want. Jason hesitated for a moment, then smiled. That sounds awesome, actually. I've been wanting to go camping. Richard smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This was the connection he had been missing. Camping it is, he said. Over the next few days, they planned a trip together, deciding on a nearby national park where they could enjoy the outdoors and spend time away from the pressures of daily life. Clara, who had been quietly observing the transformation in Richard, noticed the change in him. Richard had always been a man of few words, but now, there was a new warmth in his actions. He was becoming more present, more engaged, not just with Jason but with everyone around him. One afternoon, as Clara was cleaning the kitchen, Richard stopped by to thank her. Clara, I just wanted to say, thank you, Richard said. His voice sincere. I know I've never really shown it, but what you've done for Jason, it means more than I can say. Clara looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm just doing my job, sir, she replied modestly. No, you're doing much more than that, Richard said, his voice full of gratitude. You've given him something I couldn't. You've helped him become a better person. You've helped me see the importance of being a real father. Clara nodded, acknowledging his words but not making a big deal of it. It's what family does, she said simply. Richard stood there for a moment, reflecting on her words. Clara had always been more than just a housekeeper to him. She had been a steady presence in his home, and now, he realized how much he had taken that for granted. As the day of the trip approached, Richard felt a sense of anticipation. He was excited to finally spend quality time with Jason, away from the distractions of work and the pressures of his lifestyle. The trip was a chance for them to bond, to talk, to create memories that would last. It was the beginning of something new, something he had been longing for. Richard was determined to continue this journey of change. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right path. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt hopeful. The morning of the trip, they packed up the car and headed out. The road stretched ahead of them, winding through the countryside as Richard and Jason chatted about everything and nothing. It was a simple, peaceful moment, but to Richard, it felt like everything. They arrived at the park and set up camp, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the smell of the fresh air filling their senses. As they sat around the campfire that night, Richard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. Jason was laughing, telling stories about his friends at school, and for once, Richard didn't feel the weight of his business or the responsibilities that came with it. He was just a father, sitting with his son, sharing a moment that would stay with him forever. That night, as they lay in their sleeping bags under the stars, Richard realized that this was the life he had been missing. This was what truly mattered. The people you loved, the connections you shared, and the moments you cherished. He was no longer the distant, absent father. He was present, and that was enough. The weekend trip had brought Richard and Jason closer than ever before. It was the first time in years that Richard had felt truly connected to his son. As they drove back home from their camping adventure, the car was filled with laughter and stories, a stark contrast to the silence that had often filled their house before. Jason was more open now, sharing details about his life, his thoughts, and his dreams. Richard listened, genuinely interested, something he had never done before. It felt like they were finally getting to know each other, not as father and son bound by obligations, but as two people who had a real connection. When they arrived back home, the atmosphere had changed. Richard was no longer the distant, preoccupied father. He was present. Clara, who had been working quietly as usual, noticed the shift immediately. The change in Richard was subtle but undeniable. He was more relaxed, more patient. He smiled more, spoke more kindly, and even took time to ask Clara how her day had been. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Clara had seen him at his worst, cold, distant, too absorbed in his world to notice the people around him. Now, she was witnessing the man he was becoming, a man who was learning to prioritize his family over his wealth and success. One evening, as Richard sat at his desk in the study, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. He thought about the weeks and months ahead, the challenges he would face in trying to maintain this newfound connection with Jason. It wouldn't be easy, but Richard was determined to keep moving forward. He wanted to be a better father, and he knew that meant not just being there for Jason physically, but emotionally as well. As he sat there, deep in thought, Jason knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Hey, Dad," Jason said, his voice a little hesitant. "I was wondering, do you think we could go to the game this weekend? You know, like a father-son thing." Richard looked up, surprised but pleased. It was the first time Jason had asked him for something like this, and it made Richard realize just how far they had come. "Of course," Richard said, his voice filled with warmth. "I'd love to go to the game with you. Let's make it a tradition, just the two of us." Jason smiled, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." Richard watched as his son left the room, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had finally done something right. The next day, as they prepared for the game, Richard felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The idea of spending quality time with Jason, just the two of them, felt like a small victory in his journey to become the father his son deserved. They arrived at the stadium, and Richard couldn't help but notice how much Jason had grown. The boy was no longer the quiet, distant child he had once been. He was more confident, more engaged, and Richard realized that his own transformation was helping Jason grow too. As they sat in the stands, cheering for their team, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had been missing all along: connection, love, and the joy of being present in the moment. The game ended, and as they walked back to the car, Jason turned to his father. "Thanks for coming, Dad. This was really fun," he said. Richard smiled, his heart full. "I had a great time too, Jason. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Jason looked at him, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I know, Dad, and I'm glad you're here." As they drove home that evening, Richard realized that he was finally the father he had always wanted to be. It wasn't about the wealth, the power, or the success. It was about the moments like this, the small, everyday connections that made life meaningful. He had found something far more valuable than anything money could buy: a relationship with his son that was built on trust, love, and understanding. It was a beginning, not an end. And for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As the weeks passed, Richard and Jason continued to grow closer, their bond strengthening with each passing day. Richard's focus on family had changed his perspective on everything. He began to prioritize the little moments that mattered most, the moments he had neglected for so long. Their weekend trips, time spent watching sports together, and casual talks after dinner had become an important part of their lives. It wasn't just about making up for lost time. It was about building something new, something that would last. One evening, Richard found himself sitting in the living room, reflecting on how much had changed. The house, once filled with emptiness, now felt alive. Jason was in his room, working on a project for school, and Clara was tidying up the kitchen. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly at peace. His work, once all-consuming, had taken a back seat to what mattered most: his son, his family. Just as he was settling into this new routine, there was a knock on the door. Clara entered the living room, holding a letter. "Mr. Stone, this came for you," she said, handing it over. Richard took the envelope and saw it was from his business partner. The letter was about an urgent matter that needed his immediate attention. Richard's heart sank as he opened it. The pressure of his business world was calling him back, and he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had worked so hard to get to this point where he could finally give Jason the attention he deserved. But now, the pull of his empire was threatening to drag him back into the cycle he had just begun to break. As he read the letter, he knew he would have to make a choice. He could either continue down the path he had started, where his relationship with Jason was his priority, or he could dive back into the business world, risking the very connection he had worked so hard to rebuild. Richard placed the letter on the table, his mind racing. He knew the decision wouldn't be easy. As much as he wanted to remain the present father he had become, the pressures of his empire were difficult to ignore. He thought about Jason, his son, who had begun to open up to him, who had come to trust him in ways Richard had never expected. Would he risk that? Would he risk losing his son's trust just to maintain his status? Clara, sensing the change in Richard's demeanor, paused in her cleaning. She had been a quiet observer of the changes in him, and she knew what this moment meant. "You don't have to make this decision alone, Mr. Stone," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence. Richard looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. She had always been professional, distant even, But now, there was something different in her eyes, a sense of understanding, a sense of empathy. What do you mean? Richard asked, his voice low. You've worked hard for everything you have, but you've also worked hard to be a better father, Clara said. What matters more to you right now? Your legacy or your son's future? Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Clara's words hit him hard. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, but now he realized that legacy alone would never fill the void he had felt for so long. You're right, Richard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I've been so focused on the wrong things. But I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose Jason. Clara nodded and smiled gently, as if she knew that Richard had already made his decision. The next morning, Richard made a call to his business partner, informing him that he would not be able to handle the urgent matter immediately. He needed to take a step back and focus on what was truly important. It wasn't the easiest decision, but it was the right one. Jason needed him, and for the first time, Richard was ready to be the father his son deserved. When Jason came downstairs that morning, he looked at his father with a sense of curiosity. Hey, Dad, you seem different today, he said. Richard smiled and sat down next to him. I am, he replied. I've decided to make some changes. I want to be here for you more. No more distractions, no more work taking over. Just us. Jason's eyes widened in surprise. Really? He asked, his voice filled with hope. Really, Richard confirmed, feeling a sense of peace he had never experienced before. As the day went on, Richard realized that this was the beginning of something new. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew that he was on the right path. The path that led him to his son. The path that led him to what truly mattered. As the days went by, Richard's decision to prioritize his son over his business was beginning to feel more and more natural. He had fully embraced the idea of being present in Jason's life, and the changes were already evident. The cold, distant man who once thought that success and power were everything had been replaced by someone who was learning the true meaning of connection and love. Richard's relationship with Jason was flourishing. They spent their weekends hiking, attending games, and simply enjoying each other's company. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Richard realized that the more time he spent with Jason, the more he understood his son's needs, dreams, and struggles. For the first time, he felt like he was really getting to know the boy. One evening, after a long day spent at the park, Richard and Jason sat down in the living room, exhausted but happy. Jason was sprawled on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone, while Richard sat nearby, reading a book. The silence between them felt comfortable, easy. It was a silence that Richard had never thought would feel so right. As they sat there, Richard couldn't help but think about how far they had come. Just a few months ago, he barely knew his son. Now, Jason was opening up to him in ways he never had before. Richard smiled to himself, proud of the relationship they had built. But as he looked at his son, something else began to stir in him. It was the old feeling, the pull of his business, the pressure to succeed, to keep building his empire. He couldn't ignore it. Richard had always been a man who thrived on success, and even though he had made a commitment to his family, the demands of his business were never far behind. As if on cue, his phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from his partner. Richard glanced at it quickly before putting the phone down, trying to push away the temptation to return to the world that had consumed him for so long. Jason looked up, sensing his father's distraction. Dad, you okay? He asked. Richard's heart tightened. Yeah, just thinking about work, he replied, trying to mask the worry in his voice. You don't have to go back to it, right? Jason asked, sitting up on the couch. His voice was small, but the concern in his eyes was clear. Richard felt a pang of guilt. Jason had always been aware of his father's obsession with work, and though he never said anything, Richard knew it had affected their relationship. I don't want a son, Richard said quietly. But sometimes, it's hard to let go. Jason gave him a small, understanding smile. You've been doing great so far. You don't need to go back to that stuff. Richard's chest tightened. It was exactly what he needed to hear. Jason didn't want his father to return to the cold, distant man he had been. And deep down, Richard didn't want to either. The weight of his past decisions seemed heavy on him in that moment. But Jason's words gave him the clarity he needed. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're right, he said, his voice firm. I'm going to focus on you. I'm not going to let work take me away again. Not when I finally got this. He gestured between them, a connection that had taken time to build but was now stronger than ever. Jason smiled, clearly relieved. Thanks, Dad. Richard smiled back, his heart full. No, thank you, Jason. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you. That night, as they sat together, watching TV and sharing stories, Richard made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to let his past define him. He was going to be the father Jason deserved, present, loving, and dedicated. No matter what came his way, he would protect that relationship. He knew it wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. He was ready to be the father Jason had always needed. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt truly content. The balance he had been searching for was finally within his grasp. As the weeks passed, Richard kept his promise. His focus remained firmly on Jason, and their bond continued to grow stronger. Richard had never realized how much he had missed by neglecting his son. Every day now was an opportunity to build something new. Jason, who had once been quiet and reserved, was now more open, more confident. He shared his thoughts freely, and Richard couldn't help but feel proud of the young man his son was becoming. Their weekend outings continued, but now, it wasn't just about having fun. It was about deepening their connection, creating memories that would last a lifetime. Richard often found himself reflecting on how different his life had become. The constant pressure of work was no longer his top priority. His son, the very person he had once neglected, was now the center of his world. But as much as Richard embraced this new path, there were moments when the weight of his past decisions threatened to resurface. One such moment came unexpectedly when he received a call from his business partner, Henry. Richard, we've got a problem. Henry's voice crackled over the phone. There's a potential crisis in the company. We need you to come in immediately. Richard's stomach twisted. He could already feel the old pull of the business world, beckoning him back into its relentless grip. For a moment, his mind raced. The old Richard, the one consumed by work, would have dropped everything and headed straight to the office. But the new Richard, the one who had promised his son that he would be present, paused. Jason was upstairs, working on a school project, his laughter echoing faintly from his room. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He thought about the countless times he had chosen work over family. He had already sacrificed so much, time, relationships, and precious moments with his son. Was he really ready to give it all up again? He glanced at the clock. It was still early, and Jason had the whole evening free. Richard decided to take a stand. I'll deal with it later, Richard finally said, his voice steady but resolute. Jason and I have plans tonight. I'll call you tomorrow. He hung up before Henry could protest. The phone sat on the table, its screen dimming in the quiet of the room. Richard smiled to himself. He had made the right choice. That evening, as Richard and Jason sat down to dinner together, Jason looked up from his plate. Dad, can I ask you something? Jason's voice was tentative, his fork paused midair. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Sure, what's on your mind? Jason set his fork down, his hands fidgeting nervously. Why don't you ever go to work anymore? He asked. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on building a connection that he hadn't even noticed how much. Jason was paying attention. I mean, it's not like you don't work at all, right? You've just been around more. Richard paused, considering his answer. He had never been one to openly talk about his work, but Jason deserved to know the truth. I guess you could say I've been making some changes, Richard said, his voice soft. I realized that the most important thing in my life is not my company or the money I make. It's you, Jason. I've spent so much time building my career that I lost sight of what really matters. Jason blinked, surprised by his father's honesty. So, you're not going to work as much anymore? He asked cautiously. Richard smiled, reaching across the table to place a hand on Jason's. No, I'm not. Not like I used to. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to be the father you deserve. Jason's face lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. Richard's heart swelled with emotion. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he finally realized that family was the true measure of success. He wasn't just providing for Jason financially anymore. He was giving him something far more valuable, his time, his attention, and his love. As they finished dinner together, laughing and talking, Richard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt truly balanced. He had finally found his way back to his son, and it was a journey worth every sacrifice. Richard wasn't just a successful businessman anymore. He was a father, and that was enough. As the months went by, Richard's life continued to evolve in ways he never imagined. His relationship with Jason had become the cornerstone of his existence. They spent more time together than ever before, attending Jason's school events, going on weekend trips, and just talking about life. Richard had made a conscious decision to step away from his business, but as time passed, he realized that finding a balance between family and work wasn't as simple as he had hoped. One morning, as Richard and Jason sat at the breakfast table, enjoying pancakes, Richard's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it briefly before setting it aside. The temptation to pick it up, to check the notifications from his company, was strong. But he resisted. Jason noticed the phone and gave his father a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to check it, Dad. We can have breakfast without it," Jason said. Richard felt a warmth in his chest. His son had noticed the small changes, the effort he was making to be fully present. "I know, son," Richard said with a smile. "I'm trying to be better." It wasn't always easy. There were days when Richard felt the old pull, the drive to return to the office and take control of the challenges awaiting him. His company needed him, or so he thought. But the more time he spent with Jason, the more he realized that what truly mattered was right in front of him. The realization hit harder one evening when Richard received a call from his partner, Henry. "Richard, we need you here," Henry said, his voice urgent. "We're facing a major crisis. This could set us back months, even years." Richard felt his heart race. His old instincts kicked in. The pressure to return to the office, to fix everything, felt overwhelming. But then he remembered Jason, who was upstairs, studying for a test. Richard looked around his home. The space that had once felt cold and distant now felt like a sanctuary. He took a deep breath and made a decision. "I'm not coming in today," Richard said firmly. "Handle it without me. I'll deal with it tomorrow." He hung up the phone and walked upstairs to Jason's room. When he entered, Jason looked up from his desk. "What's up, Dad?" he asked, his eyes curious. Richard smiled and sat down next to him. "I just wanted to let you know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere today. We can study together if you want." Jason looked at him for a moment, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You really mean it?" he asked, surprised. "Yeah," Richard said softly. "I really mean it. I'm not going to let anything take me away from you." Jason's eyes lit up with genuine happiness. "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate it." That night, as they sat together, studying for Jason's upcoming exam, Richard realized something important. He didn't have to choose between his family and his business. He could find a way to do both, but it would take balance. He didn't need to sacrifice his connection with Jason for success. For the first time, Richard understood that success wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about being there for the people who truly mattered. The next day, Richard went back to the office, but with a new perspective. He was still committed to his company, but his priorities had shifted. Work could no longer consume him the way it had before. As he sat in his office, reviewing reports, Richard felt a sense of peace. He was no longer driven by the same relentless need to prove himself. He had already achieved the most important success, a real, meaningful relationship with his son, and that was enough. The balance wasn't perfect, but Richard was learning every day. He had made the choice to be present, to make time for the moments that mattered. He knew that life would continue to throw challenges his way, but now, he was prepared to face them with a clear heart and a renewed sense of purpose. Jason had helped him see that there was more to life than just chasing success. The journey wasn't over, but Richard was on the right path. And for the first time, he felt at peace with the man he had become. As time went on, Richard found himself in a constant battle between his personal life and his business. His commitment to Jason was unwavering, but the responsibilities of his company were always lurking in the background, pulling at him. He had made a decision to be present, to truly be there for his son, but the pressure from the business world still weighed heavily on his shoulders. One morning, as Richard sat with Jason in the kitchen, having breakfast before school, his phone buzzed on the counter. The familiar feeling of anxiety crept up his spine, but he ignored it. Jason looked up from his cereal and raised an eyebrow. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Richard smiled, trying to brush off the feeling. "Yeah, just work stuff," he said casually. Jason nodded, but Richard could see the worry in his son's eyes. He had noticed it before. the subtle way Jason had become more aware of Richard's moods. It made Richard stop for a moment. How had it come to this? How had his obsession with work affected his son in such a way? Richard took a deep breath, setting his phone aside. "Jason," he said softly, "I want to make something clear." Jason looked up, his expression softening. "What's up, Dad?" Richard hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I know I've been caught up with work a lot, and I've been trying to find balance. But I need you to know that you come first. No matter what happens with the business, I will always choose you." Jason's face lit up with a genuine smile. "I know, Dad. I can see it. You've been different lately, and I'm glad." Richard smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "Thanks, Jason. It means more to me than you know." That evening, as Richard settled into his office, ready to catch up on the work he had put off, the familiar tension returned. His company was in a good place, but there were always new challenges to face. Just as he was about to dive into the work, his phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Henry. "Richard, we need you at the meeting tomorrow. This could make or break the next phase of our expansion." Richard looked at the message, his fingers hovering over the phone. He felt torn. The old Richard would have jumped at the chance to prove his worth, to ensure the success of his company. But now, as he thought about Jason, about the promise he had made, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, instead of attending the high-stakes meeting, Richard spent the day with Jason. They went to the park, played basketball, and even talked about Jason's plans for the future. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of peace. He was no longer consumed by the fear of losing his place in the business world. He had made the decision to be there for Jason, and that was enough. As they walked back home, laughing and enjoying the afternoon, Richard realized something important. He didn't need to prove himself through work anymore. He didn't need to chase after success at the cost of his happiness. He had already found success in the moments he shared with Jason, in the connection they had built. The balance he had been searching for was right in front of him. And for the first time, Richard felt truly fulfilled. The journey wasn't easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but Richard was ready to face them. He knew now that the most important thing was his relationship with Jason, and he would do whatever it took to keep that bond strong. As they entered the house, Richard looked at his son and smiled. Jason was more than just a reflection of his past mistakes. He was the future, the hope, and the love that Richard had always needed. And for the first time, Richard knew that everything would be okay. As Richard settled into his new routine, spending more time with Jason and finding a healthier balance between work and family, he felt a profound sense of contentment. The man he had become was not defined by his wealth or success, but by the connection he had with his son, the relationship they were building together. Yet, despite this newfound peace, the inevitable pressures of the business world were never too far behind. Richard knew he couldn't completely escape the demands of his company, but he also knew he had to continue prioritizing Jason. One Friday afternoon, as Richard was leaving the office for the day, he received an urgent call from his business partner, Henry. "Richard, we need to talk. This could be a game changer for us," Henry said, his voice tense. Richard hesitated, his mind immediately racing back to the world he had tried to distance himself from. He glanced over at the clock. Jason would be home soon. Richard knew that, for him, his son came first. "I can't do this right now, Henry," Richard replied, his voice firm. "This can wait. I'll handle it next week." Henry's voice faltered, clearly shocked by Richard's response. "You sure? This is important." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the decision, but also the certainty that he was making the right choice. "I'll talk to you later. Take care of it for now," he said before hanging up. Richard took a deep breath and looked out of his office window, feeling a rare moment of clarity. He had made the decision. His company would never again be his sole focus. It was time to walk away, at least for a few hours, and focus on the things that truly mattered. As he walked into the living room later that evening, Jason looked up from his homework. "Hey, Dad, you're home early," Jason said, his face lighting up with a smile. Richard smiled back, feeling a surge of warmth in his chest. "Yeah, I decided to call it a day. Thought we could hang out for a bit." Jason's eyes brightened. "That sounds awesome. I was just thinking about you. We should watch that movie we've been talking about." Richard nodded, his heart full. "Sounds perfect." They spent the evening together, laughing, talking, and enjoying each other's company. It was moments like this that reminded Richard why he had made the changes he had. No amount of money or business success could compare to the connection he had with his son. The next morning, Richard woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The phone call from Henry was still on his mind, but it no longer carried the same weight. The pressures of the business world no longer consumed him. He had found a new sense of fulfillment in his relationship with Jason, and that was more important than any deal or expansion. Later that day, as Richard and Jason were walking through the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air, Jason turned to his father. "Dad," Jason said, his voice thoughtful, "I just want to thank you for everything. I know you've been working hard to be there for me, and it means a lot. You don't have to do all this, but you do, and I really appreciate it." Richard stopped walking for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. "Jason, I do it because you're worth it. You always have been. I'm just glad we're spending time together." Jason smiled, his face lighting up. "You're the best, Dad." As they continued their walk, Richard felt a sense of peace that he had never experienced before. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. His business was never far from his mind, but for the first time, Richard was confident that he could face them with the balance he had found. It wasn't about having it all. It was about knowing what truly mattered. And what mattered most to him was being there for Jason, being the father he had always wanted to be. Richard had finally come to terms with the fact that success was not about financial gains or accolades. It was about the relationships we build, the love we give, and the time we spend with those who matter most. And as he walked side by side with Jason, Richard knew that, in the end, he had made the right choice. He had found what he had been searching for all along, a meaningful, fulfilling life with his son at the heart of it. The days that followed Richard's decision to prioritize his family over work continued to show him the rewards of his choice. Jason was thriving, and Richard could see the growth in his son, emotionally and academically. Their bond had deepened, and Richard was more present in Jason's life than he had ever been. He was no longer just a father in name, but one who shared in his son's day-to-day experiences. Every weekend, they tried something new, whether it was hiking, cooking together, or watching movies. These moments became cherished memories, the ones Richard had missed out on before. Yet, as things started to settle into a peaceful rhythm, the reality of the future loomed large. One afternoon, as Richard was reviewing some business documents at home, he felt a familiar pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? His company, despite his efforts to step back, still needed him. And though he had made great strides in finding balance, the temptation to return to the old ways was still there, hovering at the edges of his mind. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jason spoke up, as if sensing his father's internal conflict. "Dad, I've been thinking," Jason began, his voice cautious. Richard looked up from his plate, his attention now fully on his son. "What's on your mind, buddy?" he asked, leaning in slightly. Jason hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I know you've been working hard on balancing things, but are you sure you're okay with not going back to work more? I mean, I know we have more time together, but I don't want you to feel like you're missing out on something you worked so hard for." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Jason's words hit him harder than he expected. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of his decision. Had he made a mistake by stepping away too much? "Jason," Richard said softly, putting his fork down, "I'm more than okay. In fact, I've never felt better. You've given me something that all the work in the world couldn't. This time with you, the memories we're creating, it's worth everything to me." Jason's eyes softened. "I'm glad, Dad. I just wanted to make sure." Richard smiled, the relief washing over him. He realized then that he had been afraid of something that wasn't even there. Jason understood. Jason appreciated the effort he had put into being present. It was enough. The next few days were filled with more family activities, picnics at the park, helping Jason with his school projects, and just talking about everything and nothing. But as the week wore on, Richard's old self began to resurface in small, subtle ways. He started checking in with the business more frequently, sending emails and making phone calls. It wasn't about chasing the next deal, but more out of habit, out of the comfort of knowing that he was still part of something big. One evening, as he was having a quiet conversation with Clara, his housekeeper, Richard's thoughts drifted to the life he had built. "You know, Clara," Richard said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about the business lately, about how I can still contribute, but in a way that doesn't take away from my family." Clara looked up, her expression kind. "I think you're doing a wonderful job, Richard. You've made a huge change already. It's clear that Jason is thriving, and that's because you're there for him. Richard smiled, grateful for her insight. You're right, he said. But I think I can find a way to do both. I just need to be smart about it. Clara nodded. Balance, Richard. It's all about balance. As the conversation ended and Richard reflected on it later that night, he realized that finding the right balance wasn't about rejecting one part of his life for another. It was about integrating the two, his business and his family. The old Richard had seen them as separate entities, constantly in competition with each other. But now, he understood that they could coexist. The key was not in neglecting either, but in making sure that neither took precedence over the things that truly mattered. And with that realization, Richard felt a sense of peace. He knew he would continue to be there for Jason, to support him through every step of his life. But he also knew that he could still be a leader in his business, as long as he was mindful of the balance. It wasn't going to be easy, but Richard was ready for whatever came next. He had already made the hardest decision, to be a present father, and now he was prepared to shape the future, both in his personal life and his business, in a way that honored the new man he had become. As Richard settled further into his new balance between work and family, he realized that the challenge of maintaining this equilibrium was not as simple as it had seemed at first. Life, as it often did, began to throw more complex situations his way. Despite his commitment to being present with Jason, there were moments when the past seemed to pull him back. One Saturday afternoon, after a week filled with family activities and small victories, Richard found himself sitting in his office, reviewing some emails. He had promised Jason that work would no longer take precedence. But the flood of messages from his company, coupled with the growing responsibilities, was becoming harder to ignore. Jason's voice suddenly broke through his thoughts. Hey Dad, are you coming? We're leaving soon. Jason had planned a special trip for the two of them to the local amusement park, something they had talked about doing for months. Richard glanced at his watch. The park would still be open for a few more hours, but he had a choice to make. He could finish up the work that was piling up on his desk, or he could keep his promise to Jason. Richard closed his laptop, letting out a deep sigh. He knew what he had to do. I'm coming, Jason, he called out, quickly standing up and grabbing his jacket. As he walked toward the door, he realized just how much he had changed. The man who would have stayed at his desk, consumed by his work, was now the man who understood the value of moments like these. The drive to the park was filled with laughter and light conversation. Jason, excited about the trip, filled the car with his energy. Richard couldn't help but feel proud of how far they had come. They spent the afternoon at the park, riding roller coasters, playing games, and simply enjoying each other's company. Richard was present in every moment, his attention fully on Jason. As the day came to an end, the two of them sat on a bench, watching the sun set over the horizon. This was awesome, Dad, Jason said, his voice full of contentment. Richard smiled, his heart swelling with love. I'm glad we did this, he replied. I'm glad you're happy. The following week, Richard received a call that would change the course of his journey. It was from his business partner, Henry. Richard, we've got a huge opportunity. It's everything we've been working for, but I need you to step in. This could be the break we've been waiting for. Richard's mind immediately raced. The old temptation was there. He could go back to the office, take control, and make sure the opportunity was seized. But as he sat in his living room, looking at Jason who was playing video games, he realized that he had already made his choice. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. The success he had was already within reach, and it was no longer about his business. I'm sorry, Henry, Richard said, his voice steady. I can't take this on. I'm focusing on my family. You'll have to handle it without me. Henry was silent for a moment, clearly taken aback. Richard, are you sure? This is a big deal. Richard took a deep breath. I'm sure. This is what matters now. That night, Richard sat with Jason, reflecting on the choice he had made. Jason noticed the change in his father, the way he seemed more relaxed, more present. Thanks for being here, Dad, Jason said, his voice sincere. Richard smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. I'm always here, son. As the days passed, Richard realized that his decision wasn't about rejecting success. It was about redefining it. His success was no longer measured by the deals he closed or the titles he earned. It was measured by the time he spent with his son, the moments they shared, and the connection they had built. Richard had come to understand that the true measure of success was in the relationships we nurture and the love we give. And as he sat with Jason, watching a movie on the couch that evening, Richard knew that, despite the challenges ahead, he had made the right choice. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Richard felt truly at peace with the man he had become. As the years went by, Richard's life had completely transformed. What had once been a world of endless work, pressure, and isolation had now blossomed into a life filled with love, connection, and balance. Jason had grown into a confident, thoughtful young man, and their bond had only deepened. Richard no longer saw his business as a measure of his success. Instead, it was his relationship with Jason that defined him. He had made the right choice, time and time again, and the results spoke for themselves. One afternoon, Richard was sitting in the living room, a book in hand, as Jason walked in, looking more mature than he had just a few years ago. "Dad," Jason said, his voice calm, yet serious. "I've been thinking about my future, and I wanted to talk to you about something." Richard closed his book, setting it aside. "What's on your mind, son?" he asked, his tone full of concern and love. Jason sat down beside him, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been applying to colleges, and I've been looking at a few places that really interest me. I know it's going to be a big change, but I want to go after something that truly excites me. I want to study engineering, and maybe even go into renewable energy. It feels right." Richard felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. He had always known that Jason would go far, but hearing his son articulate his dreams with such confidence was a moment of realization for Richard. His heart swelled with pride, and he smiled warmly. "That's amazing, Jason," he said. "I'm really proud of you. You've grown so much, and I can see your passion. I'm here for you, whatever you decide." Jason smiled, looking relieved. "Thanks, Dad. I just wanted to make sure you were okay with it." Richard nodded. "I'll always support you. Following your dreams is the most important thing." Over the next few months, Jason's college applications were submitted, and Richard couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The man who had once been consumed by his work was now watching his son step into a bright future. Richard had always wanted success, but he had learned the true value of success was not in what you achieved professionally, but in the relationships you built, the love you gave, and the guidance you offered. When Jason received his acceptance letters, it was a milestone in both of their lives. It was a moment of bittersweet joy for Richard. He knew it was time for Jason to spread his wings, to step into the world on his own. On the day of Jason's departure for college, Richard stood in front of the house, his arm around Jason's shoulders. "I'm going to miss you, son," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know you're ready for this. You've got everything you need to succeed." Jason looked up at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You've always been there for me, and I'll never forget that." Richard smiled, his heart full. "I'll always be here, no matter where life takes you." As Jason drove off to start his new adventure, Richard stood in the driveway for a moment, watching his son go. He had done what he set out to do. He had given his son the space to grow, the love to thrive, and the tools to succeed. Richard had become the father he had always wanted to be, and now, his son was on the path to becoming the person he was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt at peace. He had no regrets. He had made the right choices, the ones that mattered. In the end, the true measure of success wasn't about wealth or status. It was about love, family, and the legacy of a father who chose his son over everything else.